Let me welcome you to EDU510. In this course, we're going to be exploring the fundamentals of educational research and how one can become a successful and an ethical researcher. We're going to explore what it means to do research. How is it that that's a different activity than any other information gathering activity you engage in every day in your work, in your everyday life? How can we ensure our actions are ethical as researchers? How do we actually do research? And for what purpose? Throughout the course, you're going to be engaged in many of the activities of a researcher through assignments, and you'll be able to begin the process of building resources for your own research at the end of your program and the knowledge necessary to become an effective researcher. You're also going to be collaborating with your forum group members and sharing insights and ideas throughout the course on that forum and in other ways as well. This will be invaluable to you when you work on your research project at the completion of your program. By the end of the course, my goal as your instructor is that you're going to feel much more confident about your ability to pursue your research question thoughtfully, knowledgeably, and ethically. To help us in that task, we're going to primarily be using the Creswell text. The title of that text is Planning, Conducting, and Evaluating Quantitative and Qualitative Research. It's the 5th edition. So clearly he's a very prolific author and one who writes primarily about researcher. He's actually a researcher about research. John Creswell is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Nebraska, the Lincoln campus. And I would be hard-pressed to think of a doctoral or a master's hearing that I've been a part of as an examiner or as a supervisor or whatever, in which Creswell's name hasn't come up. So he's a very prolific and very influential researcher. We're going to be exploring other authors too throughout the course who all of them, including Creswell, consider quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research, their strengths, their weaknesses, and potential areas in which they're going to be helpful in researching phenomena in education, which is your primary concern. Each of them will lay a useful foundation for your future work at the conclusion of your program and potential research in the future when you're back in your schools and in your school systems, and maybe even future PhD work, who knows. The course is organized into 6 modules, each of which lasts about 2 weeks. As this is a very busy course, I would suggest becoming familiar with the key dates on eClass, and you'll find that, I think near the top or perhaps the bottom. Anyway, I'll make a point of letting you know that on eClass so that you're aware of the deadlines well in advance. In fact, I've entered the key dates in my digital calendar so that I can, as a marker, I can keep track of marking times, etc., and make sure I block off proper time for that. And you'll want to do probably something like that as well to be sure that you stay on top of the deadlines. Because it's a course that moves along, you don't want to get behind. In Module 1, you'll be exploring 2 chapters in the Creswell text as well as an additional chapter by Creswell, which you can access on eClass under additional readings. As I've said, this is a busy course and you are all busy people, so you will need to become aware of the key dates and ensure that you are planning to stay on top of the deadlines. And your first assignment is the first module. You also can find dates for the assignments in the syllabus, and it's very important to read the assignment requirements and rubrics carefully, as marking criteria and allocations of marks will be related to those requirements. In order to become familiar with one of the key skills of a good researcher, observation, your first assignment will be to complete Part A of the observation assignment. Once Part A is complete, I'm going to post instructions for Part B of the assignment. You may think that we're being unnecessarily mysterious about this whole thing, but the reasons for being a bit mysterious will become clear once you read the instructions for the second part of the assignment. So at the heart of this course are two questions. What is research, and how do we do it well? So what do we mean by research? Well, based on Creswell, whom I've quoted in this slide, with an addendum that I've added to his definition, he says research is a systematic, and I've added, and theoretically informed examination of a particular phenomenon or phenomena in a social context. I'm adding theoretically informed because each of us, when approaching a question, comes from a particular set of experiences, beliefs, values, and one might call a theoretical perspective, although we may not be able to name what that theoretical perspective is, or an epistemological position would be another way to put that. We could think of it as a particular set of lenses, if you will, with which we examine phenomena around us. Our lenses may be clouded, they may be partial, and so on. But theories enable us to see differently, more clearly, more fully. Like lenses at the optometrist's office, each theoretical lens offers a particular view of whatever phenomenon you're examining. One may make our view more clear than another, and Creswell discusses how we make those kinds of choices. I want to emphasize that research is not opinion. It's not what we commonly refer to as common sense or even previously held knowledge. Research may confirm everyday forms of knowledge that I've just described, that we depend on every day to carry on our lives. Rather, research offers opportunities for us to see something that we may currently understand in a particular way, and then see it differently, understand it more deeply, and in a more complex way. So this leads us to the question, why research? From my perspective and the perspective of Creswell, research helps us to understand the world in which we live. For example, I've put together a list of some of the ways in which research helps us to understand that world. And this has particular implications for those of you who are already in administrative positions or are thinking about being in an administrative position, but it can apply in other contexts as well, to teachers and to other parts of society. So it helps us understand how the world is organized, or how our particular slice of the world is organized, a school system, etc. How our actions affect others, how we can live well with others, which of course has implications for our actions, but also understanding the other, how we can come to know the other. And by the other, I mean those who have a different cultural experience, perhaps a different religious background, all of the various ways in which we come to a social situation with different backgrounds and different understandings of the world. And then how we can work more efficiently and more effectively in the roles that we play in our world. So as teachers, as administrators, as students, as fathers, mothers, whatever our role may be in the world. So there's research that helps us to think about those roles and to think about how we might do them more efficiently and particularly more effectively, and how we can understand that, that phenomenon. It also helps us, and this is particularly important for educational administration or leadership in school systems, whatever your position in that school system may be, it helps us to develop policies and governance at the local, provincial, national, and international level, both in terms of how we do that, how we understand policy, how we critique the actions in, or the results of that policy, and so on. And we can research in order to enable that policy to work well in achieving the common good through the social institutions that we're engaged in. And those influences can come at the micro level, at the classroom level, at the school level. It can come at the meso level, at the community or the larger city or county level, or it can be at the macro level, at the provincial or at the federal or even international level of human activity. So doing research then follows a particular formula or a kind of skeleton that Creswell offers to us. He suggests that there are 6 major steps in doing research. And in order to at least begin to explore those, I thought I would just share my own process when I was doing my master's thesis. So my interest was, because I was a teacher and administrator in a First Nations school at the time, I was interested in interactions between First Nations and non-First Nations administrators. In our school, we had a relationship with the Board of Education in the city closest to us, which happened to be London, Ontario. And my experience was that there was often misunderstanding, both at the personal level, at the cultural level certainly, and at the organizational level. So as an example, I was involved in some negotiations with our band and the representatives of our band and the Board of Education. I was the principal of the school at the time, and when the director of education came out to meet with the band, he wanted to meet with the director of education. But the way in which our system was organized, in essence, the principal at the time, now things are different now, but at the time, the principal was the director of education for that community in terms of the school on the community grounds. And so there was this kind of misunderstanding at an organizational level. So I was interested in how these two systems that had cultural and organizational differences could work together more effectively. How could they understand each other better and work better across these differences? So that was my large question. And of course, that's far too big to research. So I had to kind of narrow it down. And when I narrowed it down, it still was a little bit esoteric, but it came down to how can administrators understand, how can we understand understanding, that is coming to understanding between First Nations and non-First Nations administrators in the particular context of First Nations education. So I had a particular experience with that, but how was I going to come to understand that? Well, first of all, I had to review the literature. So I had to look at the broader literature around understanding itself. I had to look at how systems worked with one another. I had to do a comprehensive investigation of First Nations education and anything that there was out there about First Nations education systems working with non-First Nations education systems and administrators across. As I found, there was almost none available. And just a variety of documents and various things that were available that might help me. So I had to kind of identify what those bodies of literature were, and then I had to review them and, you know, copious notes and all that kind of stuff to try to remember all of this, keeping careful track of references, etc. So I reviewed the literature, and that helped me focus my question a little bit better. And then at that point, then I could specify the purpose for my research. And I've already said that the purpose of my research was how can we understanding between First Nations and non-First Nations administrators in the Ontario context. And then I started to collect data. Now there were various forms of data that I could collect. I chose interviews, and I interviewed First Nations administrators and non-First Nations administrators and talked to them about how they understood that interaction across cultural norms and organizational norms. And then I also looked at the documents in these various locations, anything that I could find that would help me to understand things better through text as well as through the interviews. And once I had then collected the data, then I had to do something with this massive data. So I had, 3 large binders of the transcripts from the interviews, anything that I had found that was helpful in documents that I found provincially and at the First Nations level, and et cetera, et cetera. So I had these big documents. So I had to decide then how I was going to analyze and interpret this data. Now, we're not going to go into the methods for that at this point, but this is where you identify the methods that you're actually going to use to do this tasks. And then I needed to report on the data. So I did that by writing my thesis, which was significantly onerous process, very different than writing a paper, and a little bit different than what you're going to do when you're writing a project. And then I had to be evaluated. So when you're writing a thesis, you have to be evaluated by a committee. And so my thesis went to the committee, and then I had an oral hearing where I presented my data, and then they interrogated me about my data and my methods, etc. And then, I passed or I failed, and I happily passed with no corrections or revisions needed. So that was great. I was done. So this is how Creswell has developed this skeleton, if you will, and it's a very helpful one of the steps you're going to engage in when you're doing your research. Now, you'll certainly get to the reporting stage. Your evaluation is going to be somewhat different. It's not going to be an oral hearing necessarily, but it's going to be someone is going to be evaluating the data. If you were an academic, you report on your findings, usually through a paper that you submit to a journal or a paper that you submit to a conference, and then your peers evaluate that the significance and the validity of that data reporting, and anything else that they want to have you revise, and then you either get it published or you get to do something with that. Okay, so so this is the process that we're going to be talking about throughout this course, and providing you with pardon me, with more information that will help you in your own project. I'm really looking forward to taking this journey with you, and I will provide guidance, but your work is to move towards becoming an independent and knowledgeable researcher in this course and those that follow. At any time in this journey, you are more than welcome to seek assistance through email, we can Skype, we can arrange to phone, etc. And so there are lots of ways in which we can have conversations about your work, about the assignments, etc. So never hesitate to get in touch with me. And usually the sooner you have questions, the better it is to get in touch with me so that we can kind of nip things in the bud. So welcome, and I wish you all the best as you embark on a new year, a new course, and a new responsibility as an educational researcher.